Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the fourth episode of our fall series, where today I'm delighted to talk with Johns Hopkins Professor Frank Gavin about his new book, Thinking Historically, A Guide to Statecraft and Strategy, published by Yale University Press in September of 2025.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Francis J. Gavin is the Giovanni Agnelli Distinguished Professor and the inaugural director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Previously, he was the first Frank Stanton Chair in Nuclear Security Policy Studies at MIT. He is a contributing editor at War on the Rocks and has authored or edited 8 books. Find a link to Thinking Historically, A Guide to Statecraft and Strategy in our show notes. Let's listen in to the conversation. Welcome back, folks, to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity, and I'm excited today to be joined by one of my historian colleagues, actually also in Washington, D.C., over at Johns Hopkins, Frank Gavin, and we're going to talk about his new book, Thinking Historically, A Guide to Statecraft and Strategy. So, Frank, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Kelly. And as you know, I'm a big fan of everything you're doing over there. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be here.
Well, I appreciate that. And so we'll just dive right into it. Our listeners are fairly caught up and up to speed on this topic to some extent, because I talk about it quite a bit on here, teaching the class on history's influence on foreign affairs. So, this book talks a lot about that, and was excited to read it, thought it was great. So both of us focus on this a lot, and have talked about it before. You've written on it before. I have, discussed it a lot on this podcast, teach the class. So, but basically what drove you to write the book?
Yeah. So like you, being in Washington and being around a lot of people who are faced with thinking about making consequential decisions about an uncertain future, I think about what ways my discipline, my background can help them. And the real origins of this book go back decades. When I was an undergraduate, I was at the University of Chicago. I had the great honor of being a research assistant to one of the most famous international relations professors for several years. Was a political science major, took a lot of great courses, and just thought to myself, wow, I was given this kind of intellectual sort of toolkits to understand the world. Graduated in 1988, and then 1989 happened. The extraordinary revolutions in Central Europe, even around the world, and eventually then the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I was struck, even though I had studied with some extraordinarily brilliant professors and had, to the extent an undergraduate can, immerse myself in a certain epistemology, it didn't really explain what happened. It didn't predict it, but few people predicted it, and that's too high a bar. But so as a young person, I was just curious. Here, I wanted to understand the world. I wanted to understand the most important geopolitical earthquake in my lifetime, in many of our lifetime. And what I had learned wasn't helpful. And so to set me on a journey, that was kind of part one of the story. Part two of the story, I get a degree, a PhD in history, working with incredible scholars, Mark Trachtenberg, Walter McDougall, Bruce Kuklick. Graduate trying to get a job. There was a job at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and it was in presidential history. And as you know, the history market being what it is, I'm not a presidential historian, but I pretended to be one. I arrived there, and I have no idea what I'm going to teach. It's a school mostly with economists, with sort of governance people. And I started teaching a course called a policy development course. And in the course, I focused on 2 case studies. One I considered a success, America's Cold War policies towards Germany, and one I considered a failure, America's Cold War policies in Vietnam. We're next to the LBJ library. They were able to do a role-playing exercise. and they read Fred Logevall's Excellent Choosing War. I taught it. The students liked it. Taught it again. I got there in the fall 2000, taught it again in the spring of 2001. And I said at the end of the Vietnam set of classes, we spent 3 or 4 weeks on it. At least we don't have to worry about this again. And of course, several months later, the 9/11 attacks in the United States, and much of what American grand strategy pursued in the months and years after 9/11 struck me as being, at best, deeply problematic and would have been far wiser if it had been informed with a deeper wrestling with the past. Might it not have been successful? But I do think a deeper consideration of the past would have helped. And then the final thing was through a variety of programs, I got to be involved with policymakers and decision makers. And I saw both at the LBJ school through working with my dean at the time, Jim Steinberg, who's now my dean, and has had an enormous influence on how I think about this, and a variety of other programs. I saw that policymakers, decision makers were hungry for anything that could help them. And that the problem was less a demand side problem, a more supply side problem, that we as historians weren't doing enough to help them. So I know there's a very long-winded answer, but this got me thinking, how do I believe history as a distinct and unique way of thinking about the world? How do I think it might benefit people making decisions? And so that's what I tried to do in the book.
No, I think it's an apt description of what brought you to this, but it also talks about the issues where, folks like you and I argue that we need more historical thinking and, what you term thinking historically and historical sensibility. And, you mentioned policymakers' use of history, and we'll get into this obviously, and you mentioned in the book, sort of what I would term sort of the old textbook that we would use in this class is the May and Neustadt Thinking in Time book that was written in, 83, 84, 85, that time period. They had been teaching that class for over a decade. And the notion that, that hadn't really been updated over that period of time, and sort of your, in part desire to sort of bring that along, add new things to it, I think is a really important contribution from this book, and something that needed to be done as well. And you can talk a little bit about that as we move along. But one thing I wanted to get into before we got into the sort of nuts and bolts of thinking historically and historical thinking is you do in this book the same thing I do in my class that I teach on this, is you can't understand how to think historically or have a historical sensibility or use history as a policymaker unless you understand history first. So you spend the first part of the book talking about that. So, why should people, in your argument, understand the craft of history, and why is that such a not just a good place to start, but basically a prerequisite?
Yeah. So it's tricky because throughout the book, I'm both extremely critical of our fellow colleagues in the history discipline for some of the choices the discipline has made, but I'm also in awe of how great historians go about their work. And there's a variety of issues here. One is, as I thought about the plea that both you and I and others make for policymakers to use history, there's this belief, I think, among many that it's both easy to do, and that's because people naturally, their brains are wired to think historically. And so they don't think you need any particular training or guidance to do it. And there's a great line from May and Neustadt where they say they want to teach history to policymakers in the same way that you teach sex education to teenagers. You can't tell them not to do it, but at least if you teach them how to do it, some of the skills behind it, they'll do it more safely and better. And it's the same idea here. I think I talk a bit in the book about most explicit examples of people using history, policymakers using history, or anyone using history, they do it quite poorly, or they weaponize it. You think about some of the stuff that Putin, who has spent an enormous amount of time making historical arguments, or Xi, or others, that history is very easily weaponized. And there's also some very subtle dilemmas and difficult issues historians wrestle with, such as historical judgment, right? I always think about this as the John Brown problem. Like, as historians, we're supposed to take people in their own time seriously, um, and to empathize with them. And when John Brown undertook the Harper's Ferry raid, he was seen as a criminal, as a terrorist, right? And all but a handful of people thought that. Now we see him as a hero. And there's historians have to always wrestle with that and that sense of perspective, both in terms of where people are asking questions and when they're asking questions. And it's very hard, and there's not an exact right answer to it. So why I talked about how historians wrestle with these things is because most people access history through what I call kind of more comfort food ways, whether it's documentaries. I was just watching the PBS American Experience documentary on Kissinger last night, and I'm sure you have this experience when you're a historian and it's a subject you know about. It drives you crazy because you know all the things that it's missing. And as historians, we love that, right? The other thing about historians is there's never a final answer to a historical question. We love revisionism, and most people don't like that.
Well, for
So,
policymakers, it's, as you
right.
argue, it's like they want an answer.
They want an answer, and that's completely understandable, and they're arguing on behalf of a particular perspective and a set of goals. And so, it's I thought going through how historians wrestle with these things, whether it's questions of perspective, questions of, and even something as simple as, I think a lot of people think historians are just people who go to the past, they go to archives, they collect evidence, and they construct stories. But they also, as they construct those stories, they use extraordinary imagination, right? Most of the concepts that we think about, many of the events that we care about, they don't exist in nature. A historian or a set of historians has defined a period, a phenomena, a concept in ways that are extraordinarily imaginative. And so I wanted to capture some of that. So it wasn't just this kind of idea. And the final thing I would say about this is that I'm sure you've had this experience where you you know, go to see your in-laws, or you go to a party and someone says, "What do you do?" And they say, "You're a historian." And then they give you some opinion, right? And because everyone thinks they can do this, but no neurosurgeon, as I say in the book, goes to a party and says they're a neurosurgeon. And someone says, "Well, I have opinions on neurosurgery. I have opinions on aircraft design. I have opinions on," and I think, actually, I truly believe that to pursue the historian's craft at its best is harder than neurosurgery. But again, it's also hard to judge the results. If you're a bad neurosurgeon, people die. If you're a bad airplane mechanic or designer or bridge designer, people could die. I think a society with bad history, people will also die, more will die, but it's very hard to translate the sort of absence or presence of historical skills and actual outcomes in the world. So people just think anyone can do it.
Yeah. Well, and there's been a plethora upswing of people writing pop history books over the past 30, 35 years that are out there. And a lot of historians have been sort of head in the sand, giving up that field to these folks that don't have that background in history training. And much of what they write, it has a very subjective taint to it because they're trying to make an argument for political reasons or something like that, isn't real history, but it's getting out there to a mass audience. And that's a real problem.
That's absolutely right. And I would say one of the things, even though I'm also critical in the book of some of my friends in political science and international relations, one of the great benefits that I've derived from engaging with them is they are explicit about causality and agency, why they think the world works the way it does. And so, I talk about this in the book. If you're going to write a history of the First World War and you have 300 pages, if you spend 290 on the July crisis, that reflects how you think about what matters in the world. If you spend time going back 10, 15 years, or if someone actually says, I'm going to go back 30 or 40 years and look at more tectonic forces like demographics and industrialization and arms races, that how we weave and construct historical narratives reflect how we think about the world. And oftentimes in pop history, it's kind of just so stories. And we like those, right? But truly good history wrestles with issues of perspective, time horizons, causality, agency, different models of how the world works in ways that I think can provide great insight to decision makers.
Right. Yeah, and I think more accurately depict the world that they're working in. Because like you said, if you spend 290 of those 300 pages looking at the tectonic shifts, yes, that was one part of it, but you're not necessarily looking at the agency of the people in July of 1914 and the decisions they made. But in the real world, all of those things were going on, and that's what makes it muddier, but also more accurate at the end of the day. And yeah,
Your use of the word muddier is good because I think we are, as a discipline, comfortable with muddiness. We're comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And some of the more muscular epistemologies that model themselves off the hard sciences that seek solving for X, they can provide great insight into certain phenomena. And understandably, human beings in general, and decision makers in particular, want to solve for X. But we know through history that it's that sort of those liminal, ambiguous spaces where judgment is involved and where there is great uncertainty that can't be resolved. And I think historians are comfortable with that. And that comfort, I think, can translate to more effective decision making.
yeah, and a better understanding of that historical background and what historians do starts to get you on the road to one of the two arguments that you make in the book about these interconnected arguments that drive the book is the notion of historical sensibility. So what is your definition of historical sensibility?
Historical sensibility, I think the best way to think of it is a temperament or a sort of a attitude towards the world that comes from wrestling with the past. When you go to the past, you're traveling to foreign and different worlds. And that experience, which opens your mind and sensibilities to completely different ways of seeing questions that you thought were settled. And it almost doesn't matter where you go or when you go, but you wrestle with when you encounter that past, those things that are shared in the human experience across time and space, and those things that are fundamentally different depending upon the circumstances, the context, the conditions of the world you travel to. And I think that just sort of generates a sort of a sensitivity and a mental awareness of how some things that we take for granted, that we believe to be a part of our permanent reality, are historically created, while at the same time generating a certain connection and fellowship with any human being at any time because of the sort of similarity of the human condition. And it generates a sort of what I mentioned earlier, this kind of comfort with uncertainty, this sense of empathy, though not sympathy, with the different circumstances that different people in different places at different times have faced, a certain curiosity. And it also causes you to perhaps look for the historical action, so to speak, in unusual places that might not be your first place to go. You surface the lives and issues and actions of different people, different entities in different ways than you might without this historical sensibility. And I think when you import that into the present, you have a sense of curiosity, a sense of awareness that, let's say you're a diplomat and you're engaging with your interlocutors in Beijing, that they have a completely different history than you, a completely different understanding of the world. And you don't have to agree with it, but you have a sense for why that might be different. And so that sensibility, which I think comes from the act of us looking to the past, looking to different times and different places, generates that I think other epistemologies don't.
Yeah, and I think the point you made about the empathy and having sort of a historical empathy for where other people are coming from is extremely important, and that's one of the things, it's similar to the idea of placement that May and Neustadt talk about, and that's one of the things I really try to hammer home to students, is, understanding the historical background and thinking of those you're negotiating with, whether it be your interlocutor in Beijing, or if you're at the State Department, the person that's sitting at the Defense Department, and understanding that institutional, where you sit is where you stand, or where you stand is where you sit. And, I find that extremely important. And to your point earlier about decision making in Vietnam and then decision making in Afghanistan and, post 9/11, I think more of that sort of thinking would have benefited policymakers trying to understand the other side more and looking at their history more, was lacking, I think. But so historical sensibility is the first aspect of this two-part argument, and thinking historically is the second. So how is that different?
When I was wrestling with this and trying to describe what the historical sensibility was, which is, I think, a temperament, which I think if it was a part of our larger culture, would make the world a much better place, right? I think if people had this, but as you said earlier, decision makers, let's say in the United States, if you're a Secretary of State or a national security advisor or head of the Pentagon, you work for the President of the United States, who's been elected democratically on a certain political platform. They have certain issues and they are advocating on behalf of certain interests at a particular time. They're not interested necessarily in this sort of, for lack of a better term, this kind of airy-fairy notion that because I talk about in the book that history does have this challenge, if that anything goes, almost this historical vertigo, right? If you do too much of the Rashomon thing where anyone can be right or any perspective can matter, that doesn't help for someone who has to make difficult decisions that have enormous consequences, especially in the United States, often in terms of blood and treasure, right? And who aren't necessarily thinking 40, 50 years out, but have a decision right in front of them. And so I decided to um, then think about some of the specific skills that thinking historically would impart to someone making decisions. Again, to step back a bit, the dilemma was I kept thinking about, you've been in this situation where a principal, foreign policy principal, has a half hour to meet with experts. 15 minutes is with, let's say, an economist or an IR theorist, and 15 minutes is with the historian. And the historian who just has the historical sensibility, the IR theorist comes in and says, well, rising powers fight declining powers automatically. If we look at the 14 cases, it happens 9 times. And in those cases, you have to do this. And they're very sharp and clear. And the whole time the historian's losing their mind because they're saying, oh, you got the Peloponnesian War all wrong. You had the War of Jenkins Ear all wrong. And so I was trying to imagine what the historian would do that would be more constructive, except for kind of being upset at the misuse of history. And I talked about a set of specific skills that historians, through their work, which could be converted into that sort of brief meeting. And, uh, a lot of them, are pretty obvious and pretty easy. But the main one, there's like 7 of them, but the main one was asking better questions, and I come up with this checklist of 12 questions, historical questions, and it's based on Atul Gawande's great checklist idea, first in the 1930s when the United States was building better long-range bombers for World War II. They kept crashing. They realized they were crashing because of the complexity of the systems, and there was a lot of human error. So if you ask some basic questions that were consistent and rigorous, you massively decreased error. Gawande applied this to emergency room medicine. So I use this model. It's not perfect. There are differences because in the emergency room and aircraft, it's more binary, whereas in history, it's not. But that if you were to go through these questions and ask them and fully wrestle with them, that my belief was you would generate better insight. And I guess the image I use in the book is that when you think about thinking historically, it's like a magnet. And the magnet looks upon a mass of material and is able to pull out all sorts of issues from an infinite past that you wouldn't have expected, right? Sometimes a magnet can identify an item that isn't visible to the naked eye. And history can kind of pull those voices, arguments, phenomena, institutions that you wouldn't see. And thinking historically is like the chemical dye. So you have all this material. There's a mass of stuff. What actually matters? And the chemical dye ruthlessly separates out which is not relevant to highlight on the sort of materials you matter. So it's like the magnet and the chemical dye is how I think about how historical sensibility and thinking historically married together.
Yeah, and I think the notion of asking questions and getting better questions and asking more questions is so important, and that's one of the things I really try to impart on my students is when you use history more, when you interrogate history more, it causes you to ask more questions, which forces you to really focus in on the current situation even more and ask more questions of that as you're trying to find comparative or other historical episodes that you can use in the current situation. And I think that is such a drastically important aspect when using history is really diving into both of them and not just staying on the surface level. I try to talk to students about this because, as you mentioned in the book too, and I know you're familiar with Kong's book Analogies at War, and we've read that before in my class. Your brain is literally wired to use analogies and to think of things that try to put this in perspective for you. So regardless of whether we're trying not to use analogies, we are going to. So we need to work at ways to try to figure out how to interrogate that better and make better use of it. So we're not just using these surface level comparisons. And that's where where you get into such trouble. And moving to my next question, I think you provide a whole chapter which is fascinating to me, looking at how those surface level analogies can get you in trouble. And you interrogate the Cold War and demonstrate all the different ways that people can view the Cold War differently and why that's so important and can have such an effect on policymaking if policymakers are using that. So talk to us a little bit about how you use the Cold War in this book.
Sure. Like you, living in Washington in the last couple of years, I've heard a lot of people talk about this so-called Cold War II and this return to the Cold War. And as you said, there has been work that often interrogates analogies. May and Neustadt do this, and the Analogies at War does this. But typically what they do is they say, is the thing in the present like the thing in the past? Is the current rivalry between the United States and China like the thing in the past? What is great about a historian is I can turn around and say, you have no idea what the Cold War was, right? And the fascinating thing for a historian is to wrestle with, the Cold War doesn't exist in nature. It was named, and there's lots of controversy over who named it and how it was named. But um, eh, I what I do is I ask 5 basic questions. When it began, when it ended, why it ended, how it interacted with other global forces going on in the world at the same time, and how much of it was a policy story. And just on the basic question, if people want to say we're in Cold War II, and I say, well, do you know what Cold War I is? You could ask a simple question. Well, you should know when it began. And if you were to ask a bunch of people, great Cold War historians, when it began, you would get different answers. So my advisor, Mark Trachtenberg, really sees the first 4 years, 3 or 4 years after the end of World War II as not really the Cold War, that it really begins with the series of crises, beginning with the Soviet detonation of the atomic bomb, the rise of the Communist Party in China, South Korea's invasion, and then North Korea's intervention. So 49-50 is really the origins for him. Many conventional assessments put it at some time in 1946 or 1947. But if you were to look at Mel Leffler's book or David Engerman, they see it as beginning in 1917 with the Russian Revolution and Wilson's intervention in the First World War. Then Arnie Wested wrote a great book called The Cold War, and he places the Cold War in the late 19th century. And what's important about this is they're all great historians. I'm actually fine with them all disagreeing, which drives normal people nuts, but I know you agree. I get said they're all great. They're all right and wrong at the same time. But by wrestling with what they're actually saying about these different dates is they're identifying different causal forces, right? So if you think ideology really matters, 1917 makes sense. If you think it's some kind of difference in a way of organizing society economically, the late 19th century makes sense. If you think it's discrete um, political circumstances, you might pick 1949. And it gets to um, it, asking when these things begin gets to that question of agency and what matters in the world. And I talk about this in the book a bit, but Ben Stell has this great book about Henry Wallace. And we know in the summer of 44, Roosevelt wanted to get Wallace off the ticket, but FDR also hated confronting anyone. And he goes through this whole crazy, elaborate thing where both Wallace still thinks he's the vice presidential candidate and Truman thinks he's the candidate. It is very easy to imagine Wallace staying on the ticket. So then you ask yourself, what if Wallace is president and not Truman? Do you get a different set of political outcomes? Do you get the Cold War or not get the Cold War? Because as you know, a lot of Cold War historiography really says the move from Truman to FDR is the key thing that worsened relations with the Soviet Union. Well, what that tells you is that these larger systemic forces, ideology, geopolitics, may not be as important as who is the leader at the time, right? So the point is both to complicate the analogy going to the past, but then force people to think, what do they believe matters in the world? Because policy is all about intervening in the world to change things that we don't like or to make things better. And to do that well, you need to have a theory about what things matter. And the only laboratory we have for that is history. So wrestling with these historical questions you're able to wrestle with what you think matters in the world. Just like, because one of the questions, I sometimes do this jokingly, but I ask my students when the Cold War ended. And, there's a similar debate about that. And I give my argument, which is the halftime of the 1984 Super Bowl when the famous Apple computer ad came out, right? And I'm half joking, but behind that demonstrated this extraordinary lead, not just in American technology, but in culture. You watch that Apple ad and you're sitting, in Sofia, Bulgaria, if you get to watch it, you're like, I want that. Like, whatever this is, I don't want. And if you're sitting in Moscow, you're like, I can't compete with that. But that answer reveals that I believe the end of the Cold War had more to do with Apple Computer, Levi's jeans, and Napa Valley wine tests than it did with decisions in that the NSC was debating. But that's a particular argument, right? And if you force people to wrestle with those arguments, I think it helps them think more about how to intervene in the world to produce the sort of better outcomes they're looking for.
Yeah, and you mentioned too the great Kotkin article in Foreign Affairs where he argues that the Cold War hasn't ended. So, there's it really puts in perspective the need to understand what you're talking about historically. So you mentioned the checklist. So can you, I don't want to give away, have a major spoiler alert for people because I still want them to go read the book and get the book. But what are a couple, give us a taste of what is in that checklist? What are you kind of talking about here?
Sure. I'll give you, they're just basic questions. How did we get here? What else is going on? What are unspoken assumptions?
But basic, but I would say, yeah, you still need to put them down because they're so important.
Well, I'll give you the example of the one that emerges from my own earlier career in research that might be helpful. It's the sort of what else is going on because my first book was on the history of American foreign economic policy around international monetary relations in the early and mid Cold War. And when I was doing my dissertation, I looked at documents in the 50s and 60s, and I saw American presidents deeply concerned about the balance of payments problem and the fear that the loss of American dollars and gold would generate an economic situation that would be a return to 1929 and 1931 and cause a contraction of the economy and perhaps another Great Depression. Again, another use of history the policymakers had. And when I was studying this, when I went to the secondary literature, I realized that because what I ended up writing about was there's this balance of payments deficit. The economists and policymakers would say, hey, the biggest item in the balance of payments deficit is the cost of American troops abroad, particularly in Japan and West Germany. The economists would say, bring them back home. And then the strategists would say, you can't bring them back home. They're there for a reason. But the reason they were there had less to do with worrying about the Soviets invading and more that if American troops left West Germany, West Germans would be tempted to get their own nuclear weapons. And if West Germans got their own nuclear weapons, that would generate an enormous crisis, perhaps even World War III, and that not even the Allies wanted this. And that in order to guarantee the West Germans felt reassured enough, you had to keep the troops there as well as developing a certain type of nuclear strategy. So essentially, I went from an international economics question to a question of just issues surrounding German military and political status, the German question, to the question of nuclear nonproliferation, to the question of nuclear strategy. So the book linked an economic problem to a political problem, to a strategy problem, to a nonproliferation problem. When I went to the secondary literature, all those subjects were done separately. If you studied international economics, international monetary relations, there's no mention of the German question, no mentions of flexible response, no mention of the nonproliferation treaty. If you look at the nuclear nonproliferation treaty, there's no mention of the balance of payments. There's no mention of nuclear strategy. If you go to nuclear strategy, it's the same thing. What I realized was that all of these issues were connected horizontally, and you could not understand any one of them without the other. But how we study them and how, say, maybe a mid-level bureaucrat looks at them, if you're in charge of the nonproliferation issue, you're not asking questions about the balance of payments deficit. You're not even asking questions about the PSYOP or American nuclear strategy. You're just worried about nonproliferation. The president of the United States, like the leader of any country, sees how all these things are connected together. And so question number two, what else is going on, horizontal history, was an effort to show whatever issue you are looking at, it's important to ask what are the horizontal connections to other issues where if you make a choice in the issue you're focusing on, there are going to be consequences and other actors who will have a view towards it.
Yeah, I'm glad you actually brought up that as an example. I hammer this point home to my students as well, and we have read in my class the article you did a number of years ago where you bring out that notion of horizontal history, and again, yeah, it's such a key aspect to understand the other pressures of what was going on when they're making these decisions. You know, these things don't happen in a vacuum, just like they don't happen in a vacuum today. And that's a key question to ask. So I'll get you out of here. One last question. You mentioned the state of the history field and sort of the background of the loss of diplomatic history and statecraft and military history, to some extent political history. And you bring up the notion or the idea at the end of your book also about sort of a new field of study, looking at the stuff that we're talking about here. So explain that a little bit, if you can.
Sure. I think I didn't want to go on at length about this in the book. Hal Brands and I wrote a very controversial piece a few years ago that generated a lot of attention about some of the poor choices that we thought the history discipline was making collectively, and how that was both irresponsible and also harming the discipline of history in terms of declining enrollments, declining interest within university leadership of supporting it. So that's less of the issue I want to talk about here, although I have views on that. When I was at MIT in the political science department, I had the great opportunity to hang out the nuclear engineering department because I was on a search for a nuclear security position. And I never had any idea what anyone was talking about, but these guys were brilliant. And one of the things I realized about engineering at MIT was the disciplines adapted according to the problems they were asking. And so there's no such thing really as nuclear engineering. There are a set of problems and questions they want to solve. And depending on the question, they will bring in someone from physics, someone from material science, someone from computational studies, somebody from biochemistry. Because all they are interested in is solving problems. And so engineering disciplines will shape and mold, and even in the hard sciences, right? Before Paul Doty at Harvard, there was not biochemistry, but he realized you couldn't understand biology without chemistry. So they created a new field to meet the sort of most pressing, interesting questions. For reasons I don't fully understand in the social sciences, we have the same basic disciplines that emerged that were imported from the German model at my university, Johns Hopkins, and spread around of economics, sociology, anthropology, political science, and history. And even the way the subdisciplines look haven't shifted a lot. And that's puzzling to me because um, I think that history provides an enormously powerful set of conceptual tools and lenses to navigate and understand the world. In fact, I believe it's the most powerful and important epistemology to do so. The history discipline, for its own particularly its own pathologies and bizarre reasons, have decided to abandon that or not encourage that. Um, and I think that comes I don't really care about the cost for the history discipline. I think it comes at a great cost for the world and particularly my nation. And I see as this historical sensibility and thinking historically wanes, that the United States will make less effective decisions. Our cultural debate, our political debate will be poorer. So I think I'm sort of struggling with ways to recover and maintain and hopefully improve this tradition. And one idea I have is that it should be part of the curriculum of other schools, business schools, right? The Harvard Business School had the famous Biggie program started by Arthur Chandler and Tom McCraw, which is historical. It could be in law schools. It could be in policy schools. Heck, it could be even in medical schools, right? Medicine has a history. And when you make a diagnosis, you are actually using history, right? And so there's all sorts of ways that with important consequences, history is used. And so why not pull that into the curriculums of different activities, law, business, medicine, policy, international affairs, and make our case for why this epistemology, this way of understanding the world, will generate better outcomes in their field. And also, these professions are flourishing, unlike history. Wouldn't it be good to be associated with that? I mean, I also think that if you look at one of the reasons that economics has been able to flourish, it's certainly not because it's predictions, is because look at a place like Harvard or the University of Chicago, where you have an economics department, you have economists in a business school, you have economists in a policy school, right? So while there's a discipline of economics, there are competition. If you go in the United Kingdom, you see sometimes there's international history departments, sometimes there's economic history programs. This is a great point Steve Kotkin makes, that there, I love history, and I believe it's an incredibly valuable and difficult undertaking. But there's no reason the discipline of history in the United States, as represented by the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians, should get to decide what counts as history. I mean, given how they've mismanaged the field of history, it strikes me as bizarre to let them do it, to continue to do it, right? So I think different ways of organizing to maintain many of the great practices, insights, things that we recognize as good history, but in terms of how we organize the pedagogy, how we organize the research, how we reward it, how we incentivize it, who we associate with, I think I'm open to any and all solutions on that front. I offered a few in that book, but I'd at least like to encourage a debate. History is far too important to be left to the discipline of history.
Yeah, yeah, and we've had this discussion before, and the incentive structure has been a big part of this, and which ties back to that notion of pop history, and in many ways why historians won't write that kind of stuff, because oftentimes, writing a highly influential and important 1,500-word essay in foreign policy or the New York Times, something that policymakers are going to read, isn't thought of as a good use of history and your time in a history department when you're trying to get tenure. And, so people steer away from that. And things like that need to change. But anyways, Frank, I really appreciate it. I want everybody to go out and pick up Thinking Historically, A Guide to Statecraft and Strategy. It's a great read. And thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Kelly. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks again to Frank for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdalla Nasef. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.